It was meant to be one of those carefully controlled royal moments, private, guarded, and safely away from public ears. A dinner behind closed doors with polite smiles, measured conversation, and unspoken rules that everyone knew not to cross. But that night, one voice broke the silence. A child's voice. And in just one unfiltered sentence, Prince Louis said something so unexpected, so revealing, that the atmosphere at the table changed, instantly setting off a chain reaction no one in the room could stop. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The dinner itself had been planned with precision, the kind reserved for moments when unity needs to be displayed even if it no longer comes naturally. It was described quietly as family only, a phrase that sounded warm on the surface, but carried a deeper purpose underneath. After weeks of internal strain and unresolved friction, this gathering was meant to smooth edges, to reassure everyone present that nothing was unraveling. Conversation stayed measured. Laughter arrived on cue. Every adult in the room understood the invisible rules and followed them instinctively. Catherine noticed everything. She always did. The pauses between sentences that lingered a second too long. The way certain topics were gently redirected before they could gain weight. The subtle tension that followed Camilla's presence, never acknowledged outright yet impossible to ignore. It wasn't hostility. It was something colder, something restrained. Catherine felt it in the way shoulders stiffened, and in the way eyes avoided meeting for too long. Prince Louis, normally restless in these settings, was unusually quiet. Not withdrawn, but observant. He listened more than he spoke, his gaze moving between faces as if tracking emotional currents adults assumed he couldn't see. Catherine clocked it immediately. Children always sense when a room is holding its breath. And as the meal progressed, that breath grew heavier, thick with words left unsaid. Then came the silence. Not the polite kind that follows a course change, but the kind that arrives unexpectedly, pressing down on everyone at once. It stretched just long enough to feel unnatural, long enough for Catherine's instincts to flare. And into that stillness, Prince Louis spoke. The words themselves were simple, innocent in structure, but the effect was immediate and visceral. Faces changed before anyone could stop them. A chair shifted sharply. Someone laughed too quickly, too loudly, trying to erase what had just been said. Camilla's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, controlled, but unmistakably unsettled. Catherine felt the air leave her lungs as realization hit, not as shock, but as recognition. This wasn't mischief. It wasn't a child seeking attention. There was no giggle, no glance around to gauge reaction. Prince Louis spoke with the calm certainty of someone repeating something he believed to be true. And that was what terrified Catherine most. Because children don't improvise observations like that. They repeat what they absorb. They echo tone. They mirror patterns. The adults attempted to move on. Plates were adjusted. Conversation resumed in fragments. But the dinner never recovered its rhythm. Catherine sat there, outwardly composed, inwardly replaying every word, every reaction, every flicker of discomfort she had just witnessed. In that moment, she understood that whatever had been said had crossed a line long before it reached that table. What Prince Louis said lasted only seconds, but the meaning behind it echoed far longer. And as the adults tried to brush it off, Catherine realized this was no harmless comment at all. Children don't understand politics. They don't calculate consequences. And that's exactly why what Prince Louis said carried so much weight. His words weren't rehearsed. They weren't filtered. They landed raw, cutting through years of protocol and pretending. In that instant, smiles vanished, eyes widened, and no one rushed to laugh it off. Because everyone at the table understood something terrifyingly clear, those words didn't come from nowhere. The way Prince Louis spoke mattered as much as what he said. There was no hesitation in his voice, no playful uncertainty, no sense that he was testing boundaries. It was calm, matter of fact, almost observational. That tone alone unsettled the adults in the room, because it suggested familiarity rather than confusion. This wasn't a child misreading a single moment. It sounded like something repeated, something absorbed over time and accepted as normal. Catherine felt a tightness in her chest as that realization settled, heavy and unwelcome. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then came the scramble. A senior royal shifted the subject abruptly, reaching for a safe topic with forced enthusiasm. Another laughed, too loudly, as if volume could erase meaning. The flow of conversation lurched forward in awkward fragments, sentences overlapping, politeness clashing with panic. It was obvious they were trying to outrun the moment rather than confront it. Catherine watched it unfold with growing clarity, seeing not reassurance but avoidance. Camilla's reaction was subtle, but it was there. A controlled pause, a measured breath. Her expression didn't collapse, but it hardened, just enough to betray discomfort. She didn't challenge the comment, nor did she correct it. Instead, she leaned back into composure, letting others do the work of smoothing the rupture. To Catherine, that silence spoke volumes. Innocent misunderstandings are easy to dismiss. This was not dismissed. It was managed. Catherine felt her own response rise instinctively, then bury itself just as quickly. Years of training took over. She kept her face neutral, her posture composed, her voice steady when she finally spoke. No one around the table would have guessed the storm building behind her restraint. But inside, something had shifted irreversibly. This wasn't embarrassment. It was alarm. A deep maternal awareness that something had crossed from uncomfortable into unacceptable. What struck her most was not the comment itself, but the recognition flickering across other faces. There was no surprise at the subject, only at the timing, at the source. A child had said aloud what adults had learned to navigate silently. Prince Louis had done what none of them dared. He had named the tension, without understanding he was supposed to protect it. As plates were cleared and the meal moved toward its polite conclusion, Catherine felt increasingly detached from the room. She responded automatically, nodded when expected, smiled when required. But her attention was elsewhere, looping back through memories, conversations, fleeting moments she had once dismissed. A child doesn't invent discomfort. He reflects it. And if Prince Louis was reflecting something this clearly, the problem ran deeper than one sentence at dinner. As the dinner continued in forced politeness, Catherine wasn't listening anymore. She was replaying those words, again and again, searching for where they truly came from. Children don't invent narratives, they absorb them. They echo tone, language, and emotional cues long before they understand meaning. That's what made Prince Louis's comment impossible to dismiss. Catherine knew this. And as the night wore on, one chilling question began to form in her mind. If her son was saying this out loud, what had he been hearing in private? That question refused to stay quiet. It followed her long after the dinner ended, pressing itself into the spaces between thoughts. Catherine had spent years watching how children pick up fragments adults assume are invisible, half-heard remarks, careless jokes, the way a name is spoken when no one thinks it matters. Language travels downward in families, especially in places where hierarchy trains people to speak around the truth instead of through it. She knew that better than anyone. And that knowledge made denial impossible. Her mind began assembling moments she had once brushed aside. Prince Louis repeating phrases that didn't quite sound like his own. A sudden seriousness when certain names were mentioned. Questions asked too carefully for his age, then quickly dropped when adults grew tense. At the time, she told herself it was imagination, curiosity, the harmless mimicry of a bright child. Now, those moments returned sharpened, threaded together by the words spoken at dinner. Catherine considered the environments where filters drop. Informal rooms. Corridors, the spaces between scheduled appearances where adults speak freely, believing children are distracted or absent. Staff chatter, unguarded humor, dismissive asides, none of it meant for young ears, yet all of it within reach. It didn't require malice, it required complacency. And complacency, Catherine understood, could be just as damaging. What unsettled her most was the emotional tone behind what Prince Louis had said. It wasn't playful, it wasn't curious. There was an echo of judgment there, absorbed rather than invented. Children don't assign weight unless they sense it already exists. Somewhere, boundaries had blurred. Somewhere, lines had been crossed not loudly, but repeatedly enough to feel normal. Maternal concern began to harden into something more deliberate. This was no longer about embarrassment at a family dinner or discomfort with a single remark. It was about safeguarding a child's emotional environment before those absorbed cues became beliefs. Catherine felt the shift inside herself, clearly the moment where patience gave way to resolve. She wasn't angry yet. She was focused. And that focus came with clarity. She replayed her own reactions at the table, the restraint she had practiced without thinking. Years of adapting had taught her when to wait and when to act. This, she realized, was not a moment for waiting. Silence would only allow repetition. Minimizing would only invite continuation. If a child had already begun to echo something meant to stay hidden, then the issue had existed long enough to demand accountability. As the night finally quieted and the household settled into its usual rhythm, Catherine lay awake, no longer trying to make sense of what she felt. The feeling was already clear. What remained unanswered was scope. How often? How casually? How long? And whether anyone else had noticed and chosen not to intervene. By the next morning, Catherine was no longer questioning whether something was wrong, she was questioning how long it had been happening without her knowing. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. Small moments Catherine once brushed aside suddenly resurfaced with sharp clarity. A comment here. A tone there, a look exchanged when children entered the room. What once felt like isolated discomfort now aligned into something far more troubling. And Catherine realized the dinner wasn't the beginning. It was the confirmation. The memories came back uninvited, assembling themselves with unnerving precision. Catherine recalled occasions when Camilla's attention toward the children felt performative rather than warm. Moments when conversation shifted the instant they drew near. There had been smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, compliments that carried an edge, silences that felt intentional. At the time, Catherine told herself she was overthinking, projecting tension where none existed. That instinct to smooth, to soften, to assume the best had always served the family well. Until now. She remembered doubting herself more than once, pausing mid-thought, reminding herself of hierarchy, of the importance of harmony, of the unspoken expectation to absorb discomfort quietly for the sake of stability. Each time she did, the unease retreated just enough to be ignored. But the dinner shattered that fragile equilibrium. A child had spoken what adults had trained themselves not to name. And the clarity that followed was merciless. The conflict inside Catherine sharpened. On one side stood diplomacy, the skill she had mastered through patience and restraint. On the other stood instinct, raw, urgent, and unwilling to be negotiated. She felt the tension between the two pull at her relentlessly. Diplomacy asked for time, for discretion, for private conversations that preserved appearances. Instinct demanded action, not tomorrow, not quietly, but decisively. And for the first time, Catherine understood that choosing diplomacy now might mean choosing silence later. The weight of that realization pressed down hard. She thought of the cost of minimizing what had already reached her child's voice, of what could settle deeper if left unchallenged. Children absorb more than words. They absorb permission. Permission to accept tone. Permission to normalize dismissal. Catherine knew that if she allowed this to pass, she wouldn't just be protecting peace, she would be teaching Prince Louis that discomfort is something to swallow rather than confront. Her composure held outwardly, but internally the reckoning was complete. This wasn't about one person or one moment anymore. It was about boundaries that had quietly eroded under the guise of tradition. It was about realizing that loyalty to a system should never outrank responsibility to a child. And it was about acknowledging that silence, once chosen, becomes complicity. The more Catherine traced the pattern backward, the clearer it became that hesitation had already lingered too long. The dinner hadn't introduced a new concern. It had illuminated an existing one. The alignment of those small moments, the glances, the tones, the careful omissions, formed a narrative she could no longer deny. And with that denial gone, there was no safe way to return to inaction. Catherine felt the certainty settle, steady and unyielding. It wasn't anger that guided her next steps. It was resolve. A calm, deliberate understanding that this could not remain contained within whispers and uneasy reflections. Protecting her role meant protecting her children, even if it meant unsettling a balance others preferred unchanged. And with that certainty came a decision, one that would move this issue out of whispers and into formal record. Royal complaints aren't emotional outbursts, they're calculated, documented, and deeply serious. Catherine knew exactly what filing one would mean. There would be consequences. Lines would be drawn. But there was no hesitation, because this wasn't about image or hierarchy. It was about a child. And once that line is crossed, restraint becomes complicity. Catherine understood the weight of the process she was initiating. A formal complaint is not a whisper passed along corridors. It is a record that lives, breathes, and demands response. Every word would be examined, every implication measured. She approached it with the same discipline she had learned to master in public life: calm, precise, unyielding. This was not an accusation flung in anger. It was a carefully constructed account of concern, grounded in pattern, impact, and responsibility. She chose her language with intention. The complaint did not dramatize, but it did not soften. It focused on environment, on the subtle but cumulative power of tone, on how repeated exposure shapes a child long before anyone notices the damage taking root. Prince Louis's name was not used as leverage, but as truth. The emotional effect mattered. The atmosphere mattered. The fact that a child felt comfortable repeating what should never have been normalized mattered most of all. There were easier paths: private conversations, gentle warnings, quiet understandings that preserved appearances. Catherine considered them and rejected them. This was not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over. It was a boundary to be restored. Escalation was not retaliation. It was protection. She understood that confronting the issue privately would leave too much room for denial, for reinterpretation, for quiet continuation. A formal complaint removed ambiguity. It demanded accountability. Advisors urged caution. They spoke of timing, of optics, of long-term implications. They warned her that this would shift dynamics permanently, that some doors close once crossed. Catherine listened, as she always did. And then she overruled them. Calmly, firmly, because every argument for delay sounded like another version of silence, and she had already decided what silence would cost. The moment the complaint was finalized carried no ceremony, no dramatic pause, just a quiet, irreversible step forward. With that submission, Catherine placed the issue into official record, where it could no longer be minimized or dismissed as personal sensitivity. It became institutional. And in doing so, she accepted whatever fallout would follow. Knowing that protecting her child required more than careful appearances, it required action. She did not feel triumph. She felt resolve. A steady, grounded certainty that she had chosen the only path that aligned with her role as a mother and as a figure who understood the power of precedent. This wasn't about winning. It was about drawing a line that had been allowed to blur for too long. As the complaint moved beyond her hands, Catherine understood that its impact would not stop at its intended destination. Systems respond to documentation. People respond to accountability. And once those forces are set in motion, they don't confine themselves neatly to expectation. What Catherine didn't yet know was that the complaint wouldn't stay contained, it would ripple outward, unsettling the palace far beyond its intended target. When word spread that Catherine had filed an official complaint, the reaction was immediate and explosive. This wasn't a minor grievance. This was a senior royal formally questioning conduct that involved a child. Meetings were hastily scheduled. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when others entered rooms. Because everyone understood one thing, this changed the balance. The palace thrives on anticipation, but this was panic disguised as protocol. Advisors moved quickly, not toward resolution but containment, measuring who knew what and how fast it might travel. Files were requested with urgency that bordered on alarm. Calendars filled with urgent reviews that had no clear agenda beyond control. The fear wasn't simply about the complaint itself, it was about what it represented. A line had been crossed, and once crossed, it invited others to follow. There was quiet outrage in some quarters, disbelief in others. Catherine's action threatened an unspoken rule that internal discomfort should be managed, not formalized. Senior figures worried aloud about precedent, about what happens when restraint gives way to record. If this could be documented, then other grievances might surface. The system depends on silence more than it admits, and Catherine had punctured that dependency with precision. Attempts to keep the issue contained intensified. Language softened in official exchanges. Phrases were debated, rephrased, stripped of anything that could be interpreted as admission. Some suggested mediation. Others floated the idea of reframing the complaint as a misunderstanding. But every attempt to dilute it ran into the same obstacle: it already existed. On paper. Logged. Immutable. Within the palace, divisions hardened quickly. Loyalty clashed with concern. Those who prioritized stability urged discretion and patience, warning that fallout could destabilize relationships long held together by careful compromise. Others, quieter but resolute, acknowledged the validity of Catherine's concerns and the courage it took to formalize them. These conversations rarely happened in open rooms. They took place in corridors, behind closed doors, in the pauses between official duties. Camilla's camp responded defensively, circling tight rather than reflecting outward. Statements were prepared but never released. Explanations were shared selectively, always framed to minimize implication. There was an insistence on intent over impact, on interpretation over environment. It wasn't an effort to understand. It was an effort to survive scrutiny. And that posture only deepened the unease among those watching closely. What became clear with unsettling speed was that nothing could reset the moment. No clarification would erase the fact that a child had been involved. No quiet conversation would undo the documentation now threading through the institution. The complaint had transformed from an internal concern into a structural test, one that revealed who believed boundaries mattered and who believed appearances mattered more. As controlled chaos replaced routine, Catherine remained distant from the frenzy. She watched the machinery turn without engaging it directly, aware that the noise was not the point. The point had always been smaller, more personal, more urgent. While others debated optics and precedent, she returned to the only measure that mattered to her: the well-being of her child and the environment shaping him every day. But while the palace focused on damage control, Catherine's attention remained fixed on one question: how this would affect her son going forward. Behind every royal title is a parent who lies awake at night, replaying moments they wish they'd caught sooner. Catherine's concern wasn't theoretical, it was personal, immediate, and fierce. The complaint wasn't the end of her response. It was the beginning of a recalibration, one that would quietly but permanently alter access, proximity, and trust. In the days that followed, Catherine began to look at her children's world with sharpened focus. Not with suspicion, but with intention. She evaluated who moved freely in their orbit, who lingered in casual spaces, who spoke without thinking because they assumed no one was listening. Access, she realized, had become too casual. Familiarity had softened edges that should have remained firm. And so, without announcements or confrontation, she began to adjust the flow of that world. The changes were subtle, but unmistakable. Time alone shifted. Schedules tightened. Certain interactions became supervised without being labeled as such. It wasn't punishment. It was protection. Catherine understood that boundaries don't need to be loud to be effective, they need to be consistent. Those closest noticed the difference first, sensing that the atmosphere had changed even if no explanation was offered. Trust, once loosened, was being redefined. She immersed herself more deeply in the rhythms of her children's days. Morning routines. Quiet moments before sleep. The in-between hours that reveal more than formal settings ever could. Oversight didn't feel like control. It felt like presence. Catherine wanted to hear what they heard, feel what they felt, understand the emotional weather they moved through when adults assumed they were too young to notice. Her conversations with Prince Louis were gentle, never interrogative. She listened more than she spoke, letting him lead without pressure. When he talked, she validated his feelings without assigning blame, reinforcing that his voice mattered and that discomfort should never be dismissed. She didn't correct his observations. She contextualized them. Safety, she reminded him, includes being heard. Those moments hardened her resolve. Each small reassurance carried a larger promise that she would not allow her children to absorb tension without guidance, or confusion without clarity. Emotional validation became as important as physical security. Catherine wasn't reacting anymore. She was planning. Quietly. Carefully. With a long view that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. This recalibration was not temporary. It wasn't a response designed to fade once attention shifted. It was a strategy rooted in the understanding that environments shape people long before anyone notices the effects. Catherine was determined to shape that environment deliberately, even if it meant redefining relationships others assumed were untouchable. There was sadness in the process, but no regret. Protecting her family required choices that wouldn't always be understood, especially by those who benefited from the old arrangements. But Catherine had already crossed the threshold where explanation mattered less than outcome. Her priority was no longer harmony at any cost. It was emotional safety, secured quietly and defended fiercely. And yet, even as she focused inward, Catherine was aware that her actions did not exist in isolation. The palace rarely keeps its struggles private for long. Decisions ripple, assumptions follow, narratives begin to form, shaped by speculation rather than truth. Yet even as Catherine focused on protecting her family, the implications of her action were already spilling into the public narrative. This wasn't just about one dinner, or one sentence. It was about what happens when uncomfortable truths are voiced, and someone refuses to look away. Catherine's complaint drew a line the monarchy had long avoided. And whether acknowledged publicly or not, that line would now shape relationships, power dynamics, and the future emotional safety of the next generation. What Catherine set in motion carried symbolic weight far beyond its immediate cause. For decades, the institution had survived by absorbing discomfort quietly, smoothing over tension in the name of continuity. Her action disrupted that rhythm. It suggested that preservation could no longer come at the expense of well-being, especially when children were involved. In that sense, the complaint wasn't confrontational, it was corrective, a signal that some costs were no longer acceptable. Behind closed doors, the shift was already being felt. Conversations changed tone. Decisions were weighed differently. There was a new awareness that emotional impact mattered as much as public image. Not everyone welcomed that change. Some saw it as destabilizing, an invitation for scrutiny the monarchy had learned to sidestep. But others recognized it as overdue. A quiet acknowledgement passed between those who understood that Catherine had said out loud what many had thought privately, but never dared formalize. The most profound shift was philosophical. Image-first thinking, once reflexive, now faced competition from something more personal. Child-first decision-making was no longer theoretical, it had precedent. Catherine's stance reframed responsibility, reminding the institution that legacy isn't only about crowns and continuity. It's about the environment in which future heirs are shaped. That recalibration unsettled those who relied on tradition as shield. But it reassured those who feared tradition had become an excuse. Internal trust began to change as well. Not collapse, but reconfigure. Some bonds tightened through shared understanding. Others frayed under the pressure of scrutiny. The realization settled that certain assumptions about silence, about tolerance, about what should be endured, were no longer guaranteed. That knowledge lingered, altering interactions in ways no official statement ever could. There was no public declaration of victory or validation. Catherine did not seek one. But there were moments subtle, fleeting when the justification of her actions surfaced in quiet ways. A softened acknowledgement, a careful reconsideration, a pause where there once would have been dismissal. These moments mattered more than headlines. They signaled recognition without spectacle. What made the moment irreversible wasn't the complaint itself, but what it exposed. The truth that systems can only protect what they're willing to confront. That children hear more than they're supposed to. That silence, once broken, cannot be restored to its original comfort. The monarchy could adapt, recalibrate, and recover, but it could not pretend the line hadn't been drawn. As the institution adjusted in measured steps, Catherine remained steady, aware that legacy is rarely forged in grand gestures. More often, it's shaped by the moments when someone chooses responsibility over ease. This was one of those moments, and its effects would ripple quietly, shaping decisions yet to come. And as the palace recalibrates behind closed doors, One final truth lingers, spoken by a child, but heard by everyone. In the end, it wasn't a scandal or a leak that triggered change. It was a child speaking honestly in a room full of people trained not to. Prince Louis didn't understand the weight of his words, but the adults did. And that single sentence did what years of restraint could not. It exposed a silence that could no longer be defended. In spaces built on control, unfiltered truth carries uncommon force. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't soften itself to preserve comfort. It arrives plainly and leaves damage in its wake, not because it is cruel, but because it is accurate. That night, accuracy pierced layers of protocol that had grown thick over time. The power of what was said came not from intention, but from innocence. In a family accustomed to managing perception, the unguarded voice became impossible to manage. Catherine's role in what followed was as complex as it was decisive. She was not only a mother responding to her child, she became a disruptor of habit, a challenge to an old reflex that prized harmony over honesty. Her choice reframed responsibility. It suggested that protecting the future sometimes means unsettling the present. In doing so, she accepted a quieter kind of fallout: whispers instead of applause, tension instead of resolution, because disruption, when rooted in care, rarely looks clean. The cost of ignoring discomfort had been paid for years in small ways. In swallowed words, in uneasy laughter, in moments brushed aside because addressing them felt harder than enduring them. That cost finally surfaced, undeniable, when a child echoed what adults had normalized by not confronting it. The lesson was stark: discomfort does not disappear when ignored, it accumulates. And when it returns, it does so with interest. This moment will not be commemorated with ceremony. It will not be referenced in speeches or archived for public reflection. But internally, it will be remembered. As a turning point. As the evening when something long managed slipped free of its constraints. The kind of moment people recall in fragments, with lowered voices and careful phrasing, aware that acknowledging it openly would require reckoning they are not prepared to offer. For Prince Louis, the legacy is quieter, but no less significant. He will not remember the full context, the reactions, the weight his words carried. But he will remember being heard. He will remember that his honesty did not vanish into dismissal. That matters. In families shaped by power and expectation, that memory becomes a form of protection, a reminder that truth, even when inconvenient, has value. And still, tension remains. Not explosive, not loud, but present. A hum beneath routine. Relationships continue, but they do so altered, informed by a line that can't be erased. The family moves forward as it always has, carrying unresolved questions alongside tradition. The silence that once felt safe now feels fragile, aware that it has been breached, and could be again. Because some truths, once spoken even softly, can never be taken back. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.